Hello, good afternoon or good evening, good morning in any parts of the world. And we welcome you to the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, the new West Philippine Sea Catch, an online talk show that discuss the breaking news, current events, and all issues in the West Philippine Sea to educate the the international community. Of course, the Filipino people are global netizens of what are really happening in our West Philippine Sea. And and today's topic is, why is China responding to its maritime disputes in the South China Sea with the Philippines and Vietnam so differently? And of course, we would like to welcome everyone uh, from the different parts of the world. As of now, we are represented. There are 10 countries that are being represented. Of course, from the Philippines, from Italy, of course, here from Guam, USA, from Poland, Taiwan, Vietnam, The Hague, Netherlands, from Australia, from Morocco, France, and France. We would like to welcome, of course, the participants. We have researchers, students, we have retirees, of course, overseas Filipinos, military officers, government officials, NGOs, businessmen, religious organizations, lawyers, graduate students, and professors, and ordinary citizens, of course, Filipino people, and the global netizens. Again, this is another episode of the new West Philippine Sea Catch, and I would like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Dr. Carl A. Thayer. Dr. Thayer is an emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra, Australia. He was educated at Brown University in 1967, awarded an MA in Southeast Asian Studies from Yale University in 1971, and a PhD in International Relations from the Australian National University in 1977. Dr. Thayer joined UNSW in 1979 and taught there until his retirement in 2010. The UNSW has a contract with Australia's Defence Department, and Professor Thayer's career involved professional military education at all levels, from the Royal Military College, Duntroon, the Australian Defence Force Academy, where he served as head of the Department of Politics, Australian Command and Staff College, Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii, and Australia's Senior Defense Force at the Center for Defense and Strategic Studies at the Australian Defense College. Dr. Thayer was appointed the C.V. Starr Distinguished Visiting Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington in 2005, and the inaugural Francis M. and Stephen H. Fuller Distinguished Visiting Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at Ohio University in 2008. He is currently director of Thayer Consultancy, a small business registered in Australia that provides political analysis of current regional security issues and other research support to selected clients. From 2011 until now, Dr. Thayer has given more than 180 presentations to international conferences, seminars, and workshops, either in person or virtually, and has written more than 2,030 background briefs and 3,645 media interviews, and of course, counting. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, together with me, of course, before I will call on Dr. Thayer, I would like to introduce also my co-host, Captain Carl Schuster. He's a retired U.S. Navy, the former director of the operations of the Joint Intelligence Center of the Pacific Command in Hawaii, and he's a retired professor of the Hawaii Pacific University of the Diplomacy and Military Programs, and he's a defense and security consultant. And yours truly, Dr. Celia Lamkin, is also a co-host. And of course, we have my Professor Ron Lamkin, as my better half. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Carl Thayer, live from Canberra, Australia. Good evening, Dr. Thayer.
Thank you, Dr. Lampkin, and it's my pleasure to accept your invitation and to let the audience know that you're indefatigable in promoting the Philippines' interest in the West Philippine Sea. And it's a great honor for me to be here. I've sent in PowerPoint slides, and while they're being loaded, tell your audience that this is what we call scratches on my mind. And my argument, what is developing is both countries claim islands and occupy them, features, rocks, low tide elevations in the South China Sea. China claims sovereignty over everything, as we'll see, but yet it's treating the Philippines very harshly and not Vietnam. So it's not really applying its own laws uniformly, that Vietnam should also be the butt of Chinese aggression. So if we could have the first slide up, please.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And the presentation is rather short, but I just have some visuals to help the audience.
Okay. Just a few seconds. My kind of like slow, I'm sorry. Yes. All right. There you are.
Okay. Well, this is the cover slide, and that's the question that Dr. Lemkin has read out that's been scratching my minds, and this is what I want to talk to. On the left side, in 2009, there was a deadline for states to claim extended continental shelves. And Vietnam submitted, Malaysia submitted, Vietnam, Malaysia submitted, Philippines put their own in, and China did. And China tabled for the first time the map on the left showing the 9 dashed lines. Now, they originated in the late 1940s with the Republic of China, which is now on Taiwan. And people that study maps have noticed that those lines over time have got closer and closer to the shores of the littoral states. But we leave that. So there was a Zambit claim. But then the Philippines lodged a claim to an arbitral tribunal set up under UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which it won. And the tribunal ruled that the China historic claim had been superseded by the UN Convention, and that China was in possession of no landmass, an island, to be able to extend its claims to the South China Sea proper. After that arbitral award, China began to shift, and it began to claim the 4 shas, island grouping, the Pratas, the Macclesfield Bank, which is underwater, the Spratly Islands, and Paracels. And on the right, if we look, what China has done is drawn straight baselines connecting all the land features that it claims, and says everything inside this is our internal waters, and we have sovereignty over the land features, and we can claim outwards our territorial sea and exclusive economic zones. So, and the use of straight baselines like this are not the way you go about at low tide establishing your the basis of the land dominates the sea, your territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone. Next slide, please. So next slide. Okay. So what we see if we, from that straight baselines, and we look at the different color coding, that inside China's claiming features that are physically occupied by countries before it made its claims. Vietnam, Malaysia occupies 5 features, and I use features because the arbitral tribunal ruled in the Philippines case for specific ones that nothing qualified as an island under law, but they were low tide elevations or rocks. And from an island, you can claim a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. So you have 5 features by Malaysia, 7 by China, 9 by the Philippines, 21 by Vietnam, although the Chinese probing initiative claims it's 29, and they may be talking of bits and pieces. So what you have is China is now claiming sovereignty over land features like Pagasa, Titu, that are physically occupied and have been for extended periods of time. So that complicates it because now it's going to, my argument is it's going to be beating up on the Philippines, water cannons, ramming, interrupting flights, harassing fishermen. But it's not doing that to Vietnam in an area that it's claiming. And China has passed its own legislation giving its Coast Guard the right to use that kind of force to enforce China's sovereignty. Next slide, please. So this is thinking out loud. It's not an exhaustive list, and I invite the audience to help me add on to it. What are the differences between the Philippines and Vietnam? And then I end the presentation with why is the Philippines being treated differently. So one, Philippines is a democracy. So from China's point of view, you have an Aquino government, you get a Duterte government that puts aside the arbitral tribunal, you get a Marcos government that goes back to supporting the arbitral tribunal. And the Philippines, because it's a democracy, you can have a Duterte factor, Sara Duterte, who can claim that, getting too close to America is not in the Philippines' interest. Contrasting Vietnam, you have a one-party communist system, so it's similar to China. It doesn't have a domestic debate as the Philippines would over its claims. The government and the party can rule everything. And it offers a special conduit other than straight state-to-state diplomacy that the Philippines has to use for China to influence Vietnamese leaders, high-level visits. And we noted at one point, that Xi Jinping is both president and general secretary, and the current general secretary of Vietnam, To Lam, briefly occupied both positions. He's there. Now, both are members of ASEAN. Yet we don't have ASEAN really taking a strong position on either of it. But so that should weigh on China's decision as to how you treat it. This is key, though. The Philippines is a key treaty ally of the United States, and an armed attack can trigger consultations as to what the state should do about it. And we know that from an incident last year, cutting off the thumb of a Filipino seaman with spears, knives, etc., is that an armed attack? On the other hand, there's no formal alliance between Vietnam and China, but China is Vietnam's first comprehensive strategic cooperative partner. And they have a lot of mechanisms, a bilateral committee that meets every year, and members of the Politburo head that particular one. Now, the U.S. Philippines is a treaty ally, but Vietnam has a four-nose defense foreign policy. No foreign bases, no alliances, no ganging up with one country against the third country, and no first use of force. And that goes back to the 1990s as the government policies. Now, next, on law, Vietnam has amended its law of the sea to make its baselines conform more with international practice, whereas the Philippines, in a standoff over Scarborough Shoal, where it was being denied the right to apprehend Chinese fishing boats that were stealing, illegally fishing and destroying protected species, made a claim to the arbitral tribunal, which China, as a state party, is required to accept the final verdict, even if it doesn't want to show up. And we can get into the legalities. Vietnam considered, and sometimes its senior leaders have hinted at, and then I know they're constantly revising and dusting, but they've never filed an arbitral claim against China formally. Next slide, please. So both countries, the Philippines and Vietnam, around 2021 and subsequently, have begun to improve their infrastructure in the Spratly Islands. And Vietnam has done it at a scale much greater and larger than the Philippines. So in 2021, Philippines extended a runway on Pagasa and upgraded some of the infrastructure in a jetty, I believe, there. In the late 90s, the BRP Sierra Madre was grounded on Second Thomas Shoal, stays commissioned in the Philippines Navy, and the Philippines has continued to run supply efforts. And in June 1924, there was a big argument about whether or not materials were being brought there to reinforce the ship because it was dilapidated and didn't collapse. And that the ROAR is rotation of military forces and resupply constantly. And now there's an agreement that basically lets the Philippines to continue that. So if we look, though, from October 21 to the present, Vietnam began a continuing right up to the present extensive construction activities on 11 features. They've dredged harbors, built docks, established one lighthouse, have developed helipads, and a potential airstrip on Bark Canada Reef. Each one of these features maintains so-called military outposts, bunkers, and trenches. What the Chinese don't say is that it's all part of Vietnam's policy of linking the coastal economy with the maritime economy, which now generates over half of its gross domestic product. And if we talk about militarizing, the Chinese are over the hill, but think of a spectrum from left to right, putting a few people on with sidearms. On the extreme, warfighting, harbors, ports, amphibious forces, airstrips, jets, etc. And in the middle, dual use. A potential airstrip in the South China Sea can serve search and rescue. It can bring in supplies. It can also serve military purposes. So we have to be careful. In May 2022, Vietnam used cutter suction dredges from the Netherlands and then began to build their own to rapidly do land reclamation as it's doing. Now, turning back to the Philippine side, they have an enhanced defense cooperation agreement with the United States, which is extended now to 9 facilities by my count, where America's permitted a rotational but not a permanent presence. And the Philippines, with Balikatan, runs multilateral military exercises with the United States and other allied partners, and it's quite frequently includes Japan, Australia, and the odd other European country from time to time. Whereas Vietnam makes a distinction in its foreknows in the Vietnamese language, that when it's translated, military exercise has 2 distinct meanings in Vietnamese. And one is a training exercise, and the other is an exercise about warfighting. It's so Vietnam does not permit the latter. So any activity that gains on, it conducts search and rescue, communication at sea exercises, is a training exercise. And so unlike the Philippines, they're not doing hard military exercises themselves. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if we're looking at the consistency from China, from Aquino to Duterte, setting things aside until towards the end of his last term of office, to the Marcos government, which has been very proactive in defense of sovereignty and has not resiled from the arbitral award that was justly given to the Philippines. On Vietnam from 2003, they adopted a policy combining, this is Marxist dialectics of cooperation and struggle. Cooperate with countries like China, but when they trample or challenge your sovereignty, as they did in 2014 with a huge mega oil drilling rig, you struggle against it by getting the journalists from Beijing to come on your own ships and film every day what the ramming, what China was doing, sending out forces to challenge and exert Vietnam's sovereignty. But the cooperation and struggle it was reviewed in 2023, 10 years after 2013, and reaffirmed. So Vietnam has this flexible study. I don't want to call it bamboo. That's a way, it's a means rather than a strategy itself of dealing with China. 2018-19, there was a massive standoff where Vietnam had hired a Japanese ship to do survey work around the waters in Vanguard Bank. And China really put a lot of pressure on. So Vietnam stopped, had to pay millions of dollars in compensation, and it hasn't restarted. Now you can think of your Recto Bank, Reed Bank, the kind of issues that arise if the Philippines should decide to go ahead there. Finally, every year, China unilaterally declares a fishing ban. Both countries, Philippines and Vietnam, protest that fishing ban. Okay, next slide, please. Continuing with the Philippines, Raymond Powell of Sea Light Project has developed this term, assertive transparency, to name and shame and get video coverage of incidents as they occur out as soon as possible so the Philippine side is heard. Vietnam strictly controls its media, and hardly anything gets out that the public. Now, in Vietnam, you can't prevent them from getting onto the internet and finding out what's going on, but not in the newspapers, not on television. Legislation, I could go through and you could tell me a whole slew under the Marcos government, Junior, of laws establishing your sovereignty and defining what's yours. Vietnam has not produced specialist legislation of that other than the law of the sea that just redefined the baselines. Now, the Philippine Navy, PN, the Philippine Coast Guard, the Bureau of Agriculture and Fishery Resources constantly send out patrols at sea and in the air around Scarborough Shoal, around Pagasa, and challenge China's presence that are there. The Vietnamese do not send their naval vessels. They send the Vietnam Coast Guard, the Vietnam Fisheries Surveillance Force, which is under the Ministry of Agricultural and Rural Development, like the Philippine counterpart, and maritime militia. But they're not the little blue men and the Chinese. They're just fishermen at sea that do a watch and report back. So you have those differences. Now, through military and other exercises, Philippines has accepted the presence of American Typhoon long-range missiles and other missile systems, the Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, Nemesis, or you want to call it. But at the recent military exercises, the Philippines tested South Korean Sea Stars anti-ship missiles, the French Mistral 3 surface-to-air missile, and the Israeli Spike that's fired from fast attack craft. So the Philippines is really looking and buying and purchasing from abroad. Vietnam, for a long time, because it believes in defense self-reliance, co-produces, and it's mainly Russian missiles, some Israel, but mainly Russian missiles. And at their second Defense Expo last year, they showed their own special coastal and other products. Now, geography plays a role. Yes, Philippines is an archipelagic state, and it's a littoral state in the South China Sea. Vietnam has a land border, and it's a littoral state. But the Philippines is part of the first island chain extending from Japan down Taiwan, across the Bashi Channel, Philippines, and you can draw further if you want. That's important because there's a sound underwater system, and Chinese nuclear submarines that need to be able to hide in the West Pacific where they're not tracked, locations aren't known by the US, need to break through that first island chain so they can operate, or break through that first island chain as they did recently with two aircraft carrier groups and do theoretical cutting off Taiwan, isolating it, for potential future conflict or takeover of the country. And so, and I'm going to return to that point because Vietnam can't prevent China from launching its nuclear submarines and operating where they want to go. And Vietnam has a much stronger military and a capability to cause some damage. I'm not going to get down into scenarios because this is very asymmetric. So, and the land border has been demarcated, so that's peaceful. But we're not finding China's intrusion into Vietnam's space in the way that it does with the Philippines. So, next slide, please. So, why the different treatment? And this is just what I draw from it. And it reminds me that when our prime minister several years ago asked for an investigation of the COVID breakout from a Chinese lab, billions of dollars of trade was slapped on, were stopped with Australia: lobsters, beef, wine. And it was because we were speaking out and we were the object lesson. And I think in this particular case, we're saying it's to intimidate the Philippines into acquiescence. You're the only country that's robustly standing up for its sovereignty. And China cannot have a contagion effect where other countries might want to follow or support the Philippines doing that. China can play and is playing on internal divisions. And I'll leave it to you about election interfering elements of your country that take the Chinese line. That's a democracy, but it's not going to happen in Vietnam. And China's doing this to go back to pre-arbitral tribunal. It's all ours because we said it's ours. We have historic rights. We were the first to name, discover, and administer. At which point, I don't want to diverge. I always challenge the Chinese to tell me why they aren't occupying Pagasa. How did they get thrown off? What year did it happen? Were there any casualties? And they can never do that. So it's to intimidate you into acquiescence, a government. So your election cycles are pressure points. Next is to undermine, if not break up, the US-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, because that's a threat to China, because it provides a legal rationale. And with Pete Hegseth visiting and using strategic deterrence in the vocabulary, that makes China worry all the more. And particularly after the bombing in Iran, some analysts say, oh, that shows Chinese administration that Trump has got guts. It's not tacoed. He always chickens out. But there he used force itself. So it's to break that up so that you shatter the first island chain. Philippines can no longer serve as where missiles in the north can interdict shipping and planes across the Bashi Channel. So that's part of it. The sound underwater system can be disrupted, and China would make it more difficult for the United States to destroy its nuclear weaponry in a first strike, which I'm not arguing the US is trying to do. And finally, this is to intimidate other South China Sea claimant states. And my argument is immediately after the arbitral tribunal issued its award, its decisions, everybody in ASEAN, like the three blind monkeys, saw, heard, and spoke nothing about China. the words are legal and diplomatic processes that appear in one ASEAN joint statement after another, rather than the arbitral tribunal. Now, in 2000, much later, 2019, there was a cascade of letters on the continental shelf, which seems that people are seeing some of the legal foundations. But it's to intimidate other claimant states, Malaysia, Indonesia, which claims it's formally not, but nonetheless, Indonesia has a heft and certain weight. Brunei, in doing that. So why the different treatment? Because you're standing up, you're being effective, you're not prevailing completely because China has hundreds of ships that it can deploy and swarm and commit aggression and attacks on you. And it will test the alliance. But so far, the Indo-Pacific has been declared the Trump administration's priority theater, and strategic deterrence against China. And we'll see Philippines' modernization program, which is paying up, how the administration responds. I'm waiting for the National Security Strategy Report, which is supposed to be submitted to Congress when you get a military budget. And that's usually within 150 days. So we have to finally see what's occurring there. So with that, I'll end, and I welcome both additional interpretations of what I'm putting forward, and even more detail from people that know whether my attempt to compare the Philippines and Vietnam is accurate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Thayer.
Indeed. Thank you, sir. Very well said.
Yes. Thank you so much for that very excellent, I'd say, presentation and insights on why, why China is responding, of course, differently when it comes to the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. Of course, not so good, of course, with the Philippines. All right, I'm trying to remove this, and of course, I would like to. I'm sorry about this one. I'm trying to remove the slide, but of course, while doing that, there is a question I would like to read the question from our participants. Right now, of course, Dr. Dries Larafi, he's a professor, university professor of the University of Ibn Tofil, of course, from Morocco. Dr. Larafi, I can promote you, and you can, since you can ask that question. Kindly hold, sir. Or maybe I can just read his question, Dr. Thayer.
Right.
Now that the arbitration was against it, China ought to demonstrate that it's abiding by the international law. Particularly, Beijing is a permanent member of the Security Council, and most importantly, the argument of historical rights was dismissed. So I think that's a comment. So it becomes like a question too, Dr. Thayer.
Right. Well, I thank you for the question. And if we turn the clock back to when the UN Convention on Law of the Sea was being negotiated, China tried very strongly to have historic rights put in it. Consensus wasn't reached, and China went ahead and ratified the UN Convention on Law of the Sea anyway. So that's point one. Two, that when you sign on to UNCLOS, it doesn't solve sovereignty, and it doesn't solve military issues. For example, when the Philippines lodged their claim and they brought up Second Thomas Shoal, because it beached a commissioned military ship, the arbitral tribunal said it couldn't, that's a military matter. But it's there to settle an interpretation of the tribunal. And it has a provision that if you don't want to participate, that's fine. The head of the International Tribunal Law of the Sea will appoint a judge to represent China. And then after all this, under UNCLOS in the Annex 7, the decision is final and without appeal. So China, we know, has violated that, but there is no enforcement mechanism and no punishment mechanism. And where my pie in the sky is to make a proposal that if ever you could amend the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, and you find a state party to it, a country that has ratified and approved it through its legislature, that refuses to carry it out, the following should happen. All the judges that a state party can appoint to international tribunal to decide on maritime issues from that country, China in this case, should be barred from participating in any legal proceeding at all. Second, that China's membership on committees in the UN should be suspended, and that China finally should be denied a vote in the General Assembly. Can't touch the permanent 5 on the Security Council. But in other words, you join the UN, you join the Charter, and you violate it, then you should lose the right to cast votes and influence outcomes and appoint judges. Now, no judge is allowed to rule on his home country. And I'll tell a case about what happened when the first panel of judges, it was a Sri Lankan married to a Filipina. And the Chinese started a whispering campaign, and I was in Washington at a CSS conference to watch it. You know, how can that judge make up his mind he's married to a Filipina? Now, Bonnie Glasser, a very famous American China specialist, replied, you're anti-female. But there was a British academic there, and I love it. He says, we were nasty, we were imperialist power, but we did some good things. We gave the world cricket. And you know, when the umpire makes his decision, we never ask who he's married to. I thought that was, so to our professor in Morocco, yeah, we are stuck in that the ASEAN countries and China claim they're going to complete a code of conduct by 2026. That's next year, when Philippines will be the ASEAN chair. And I've gone through it, and I can quote chapter and verse that China all through there supports international law and in many paragraphs supports UNCLOS. How can you get a code of conduct? In other words, I would say you can't have that code of conduct until China finally has to admit that it will comply with the arbitral ruling. And now finally, I was at a conference in Washington where the American lawyer that argued the case for the Philippines was speaking. And word came through of a judgment by an arbitral tribunal on the case of Bangladesh against India. Bangladesh had no access to the sea, it claimed overlap, and the decision went in Bangladesh's favor. India's external affairs minister got up and said, we accept it. And the territory is given to Bangladesh, which now has an exclusive economic zone, and oil areas that India was exploiting have gone back. That is the example that China should have. But all I can say is words. Where's the enforcement? And we continue to have to put pressure on China in that respect, and praise and say to the Filipinos, keep your backbone. Don't resile as Duterte did, President Duterte. Otherwise, you're undermining international law.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thayer. Maybe Captain Shisur, would you like to have some kind of reaction to that? Captain?
Well, I think that Dr. Thayer brings up it's a brilliant point, and that is, most people, when they hear the term consequences, they think in terms of sanctions or military action. But in fact, the collective security principles behind the UN are integral to the ideas he just suggested. There should be a international judicial consequence for ignoring a judicial ruling by a UN tribunal assigned or in support of a treaty that you've ratified. So in effect, If you don't have that consequence, then countries can arbitrarily ignore the tribunal and the treaty itself without paying a price. And China's arguing for a greater influence in the international community, a greater influence in international policy, but then they violate the very rules they claim they were supporting. So if they were to suddenly suffer the removal of a judge or suspension of a judge from any maritime tribunal activities, then I think that would send a message. And it's one that they would argue against, don't get me wrong, but they would have trouble arguing against it legitimately with any kind of credibility. So I thought it was a brilliant idea. And I'm just surprised no one brought up with, if they have brought it up before, it's not gotten a lot of traction or publicity. I think it's something that should be advocated and urged.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Captain Sister, for that excellent insight and reaction, of course, to Dr. Taylor's response to the first question of that is Dr. Dries Larafi from the University of IB and Tofile in Morocco. All right, thank you. Our next question is coming from also a professor, associate professor of the National Taiwan University and Fire University, Dr. Veronica Jakubczak. The question is, what can be done to strengthen societal resilience against the hybrid threats with respect to cognitive warfare? There are prominent various narratives that PRC is using to influence the public addressing the South China Sea issues. Dr. Ver is actually here, so thank you.
Right. Well, that's a bit of jargon to bite off on. But China does have a policy of three warfares, and I think that includes in it. And all of us in the day of artificial intelligence, where you can manufacture and make pictures of people and pass them on through social media, it means that the whole of government approach in every country, with the security agencies, the law enforcement, academic community, and others, have to be constantly alert and advised. I can't get into certain details where I have been involved coming back from overseas and authorities finding things in my USBs and on my laptops. But in other words, it's persistent and it's part of a pattern in all countries. So we have to publicize it, make it transparent, come up with laws about people, your own citizens, that aid and abet in that particular way. And like your proactive, assertive transparency, every instant that comes up. Now, we have an annual report by the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, and you get the broad picture of the kind of threats that are operating against us. And that's why, and I say in the Philippines, you've heard it before, and it's not addressing the main. That's why I want you guys to come up with a better historical narrative about pre-colonial and everything to just hit back, as to begin with. But it's to expose. I mean, you've had from the gambling syndicates, from scams, from influence operations. I can read the press and see the bubbling up in the Philippines. You need to constantly have an annual report or more frequent that gives a pattern to it, and to pass down through your institutions, through your elected legislatures, through your educations institutions, through your think tanks, through your civil society groups, that this is how democracy is being undermined. Falsehoods, pictures that show you saying or doing things that people don't quite understand, and do it in real time. As quickly as possible before it takes root. It means constant monitoring, codes of ethics for social media, and holding some of these media companies to account for not taking steps to occur. So in other words, it's a whole of government approach, and mine is only one idea. And I would like to sit around the table with all the other stakeholders, and you collectively come up with a Philippine approach, an Australian approach. You can compare them, an ASEAN approach. You look at Europe and their approaches, and share the intelligence and information across borders, so a prompt action can be taken.
Thank you, Dr. Thayer. Captain Schuster, would you like to add something on that? The reaction for that question?
We used in Bosnia, which I admit was a long time ago, but we said a well-packaged lie became accepted truth in 4 hours in today's world.
Ooh.
And we're even more connected now than we were back then. And so Dr. Thayer's point is very valid. You not only have to be fast, but you also have to be precise and accurate. And I think also what the Chinese have done a very good job of is what I call the foundation of knowledge. They build their narrative over a period of years unchallenged. And so many aspects of their themes, if you will, or their narrative have not been challenged until now. And so there is a sense of legitimacy and credibility in that narrative already inherent in much of the public mind. So one of the things you have to do, getting back to the whole of government approach, is use your own access to social media and get the knowledge of Philippine sovereignty, how long you've been there, how long have the Philippines been fishing in those waters, what was it like before the colonial period, and what's it been like since. Another theme to think about is, for all these Asian countries who have only so recently regained their independence, it would be unacceptable for us to sacrifice any sovereignty to a new imperialist power. Newly gained independence is appreciated and it should be valued. And therefore, if what you're hearing is intended to convince you to give way on something of your national interest or your sovereignty, then you need to counter it and look for the inconsistencies. One of the things China does and has gotten away with for years is they'll say one thing as a principle, and then 2 weeks later, they'll be 180 degrees different, the exact opposite, and it's been that way since ancient times. And I'll just pick an example of the last 3 years. Prior to 2021, China stated that Taiwan Strait was international waters. Then Taiwan complained about them encroaching on the other side of the median line, and China said, but the Taiwan Straits have been Chinese territorial waters since ancient times. Well, which statement is true? The statement from before 2019, where they emphatically insisted it was international waters, or did they suddenly discover it was Chinese waters? Exposing those dichotomies, which is what you've done with their actions in the South China Sea, over time chips away at that knowledge foundation on which their narrative relies. In that way, when they produce a new theme, you've got the facts, gather it together, hit back, but also find a way to share that with other media outlets and other governments. Because believe me, political warfare is an integrated affair in the People's Republic of China. It has both a domestic and an international element. And their military actions are directed to conform and support that political warfare narrative. Their media reporting and official statements support that political warfare narrative. And their legal activities and presentations in international fora are also integrated into that narrative and intended to support and further it. And so your cognitive warfare is a fancy term for they're coming at your opinions and knowledge from multiple directions so that you begin to interpret things in the same way the Chinese want you to interpret it. That's all that refers to. It's a fancy word, gets you new funding, if you will, if you're a government entity. But the reality is they are simply using their three warfares approach, media warfare, public opinion warfare, and legal warfare or lawfare, to alter the international knowledge and opinions of things that China sees critical to advancing its interests and influence. So
Thank you.
I've walked the 5 miles across the street, but it's a complex topic.
All right. Thank you so much, Captain Captain Schuster, of course, Dr. Freyer. Okay, good. We have another question coming from Ms. Jewel and Changes. She's a researcher from the Women's Alliance for Security and Peace, or WAS. Her question: what specific lessons from Vietnam's military modernization and self-reliant defense posture can the Philippines adopt to enhance its own maritime security strategy and reduce vulnerability to coercion in the West Philippine Sea? Thank you.
Well, from the mid 1990s, Vietnam engaged in a massive new modernization program for Army, Navy, Air Force. It took Gepard frigates, Kilo class submarines, Su 27s, Su 30s, Bastion defense systems along the coast, etc. At the end, every 5 years, they have a National Party Congress, and in 2021 was the last time, the 13th. And it ended by approving a military Congress that the most military modernization program in Vietnam's history was going to be carried out. And by 2030, some elements were going to be up to modern standard. And beyond that, 2025, I should say, that's this year. And by 2030, the whole, and they listed from Navy, Air Defense, Air Force, Navy, all the way down to Cypher and other areas. 2 months later, Russia invaded Ukraine. The last major purchase that Vietnam made, and its 60-odd% dependence on Russia for supplies, was the T-90 main battle tank. And all you had to do is watch American javelins and whatever the name of laws, whatever the British thing, they were being destroyed. And Vietnam knew that if it tried to move towards Russia, it would be under sanctions. And I have a chart, and we're spending, just prior to all this, over $1 billion a year on Russian equipment. That plummeted. And you're talking 100 million, 200 million in purchases. And it's like South Korean self-propelled howitzers. It's American T-6 trainers and Scan Eagles, Czech trainer aircraft. It's not what they need. Because what I'm really trying to get into, every day we turn on our TV and watch what the Ukrainians and Russians are doing each other. Recently, the Vietnamese media wanted to know why everybody in Vietnam was looking at the sinking of Russian ships in the Black Sea. I said, it's obvious. If Ukraine can do it, then China has to be very wary about the capabilities that Vietnam could launch if a crisis turned into a shooting war. So, what I'm really getting at is the phase of modern warfare: artificial intelligence, hypersonics, massive strikes, and putting up aircraft that can shoot back at the incoming. I'm not a military man, but in other words, what can the Philippines learn? You don't fight last year's war. And since Vietnam, it was strong, but it has legacy. And now it's top of the line. Fighters can't even get safety certificates to fly, and it can't get spare parts. So its attempt to be self-reliant, it became over-dependent on Russia, and diversification is the new mantra. But that costs money. It means changing the logistics base. The Vietnamese submariners go to sea. Everything's in Cyrillic, and they talk in Russian. So for the Philippines, though, you have a modernization program. What you do is interact with the U.S. and Japan and all the other countries, even get to Ukraine, learn from them about and learn from countries that are learning from them, to redesign the modernization program to suit the new realities and to create the asymmetric threat that you can offer that Ukraine can. If Ukraine, it's not a nice thing that we're learning Trump now is holding back some of the supplies because they're running out in America. we leaving all that aside, the Philippines, you can't be reliant on one country. You have to be adaptive. You have to build your own national defense industry. As I was mentioning, you look at the missile systems, Vietnam made clear they wanted co-production, technology transfer, so they could make and modify anti-air missiles, ship-to-air, etc. So the modernization program has to be redesigned, and it's looking at world best practice. It's, you know, in other words, your diplomats are everywhere. Your defense attaches are there. Get them working. What are the threats? What can we do? What are the vulnerabilities that a Chinese warship would face out at sea? How can we adapt to that? And yes, it means spending, but I want to step back. When everybody's, you know, we're here in Australia, where we only want to go to 2.3% of GDP, and the US wants us to go to 5%. I want to blow a whistle and say, where did the 5% come from? We need leadership from America to say, if we're going to create a deterrent to China or Russia or, you know, China, how would we use all our allies? What capabilities do we want them to have? Let's make this interactive, and you work out the costs later. What is it that America would like its NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, to develop in their theaters that could work with the US? And it should be interactive between the two. But in other words, I would challenge Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, come on, stop using a number. Tell us where you got it. What were you planning? What would be your dream budget and strategy for all the countries to cooperate and work to deter, let's say, China in the Indo-Pacific, Russia in the Ukraine? So for the Philippines, to answer that question, you're going to have to spend, but don't pluck an arbitrary number out of nowhere. What are the capabilities? Because, you know, as one think tank in Australia said, what, you get Liechtenstein to pay 5% of defense, and what do you get? Germany to pay 5% of GDP. Boy, you're going to get something. You've got to plan it. In other words, one shoe doesn't fit all. And then you have to look at, you know, the NATO one is it's 1.5 into other related security to reach that 5% figure. So that's kind of my chalk on a whiteboard, you know, work in progress for discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thayer. So may we ask, Captain Schuster, from the military point of view?
Well, he's hit the nail on the head. The problem with the way we talk with our allies about defense is what we used to call a cookie cutter approach. We know what we would get for 5%, and so we assume they're going to have the same requirements and approach the same way. And I would argue, for example, that Germany is primarily a continental country, so their defense spending would be focused on their primary national interests first, and then where they integrate into NATO later. In the case of the Philippines, for example, and indeed any country in Asia, your maritime interests take preeminence. But maritime in these days, I refer to the theater as an air and naval theater. Nothing works well on the water if it doesn't have protection from overhead. The other thing I would throw in there, and I'm building on Dr. Thayer's point, I'm one who views the fighting in Ukraine as the conceptual equivalent to the Spanish Civil War before World War II. The people that studied the Spanish Civil War and drew the right lessons from it enjoyed a significant early advantage in World War II. And those who just put it, well, it's a civil war, it doesn't matter, they woke up wounded. And so if you look at the Ukraine, they've made a lot of mistakes in the use of drones, but they've also done a lot of wise things. But the most important thing they've done is they've introduced unmanned systems as a contributing element in the combined arms integrated into your defense. And the Russian use of missiles tells you, or tells me, that if you don't have an integrated air and missile defense, then nothing you put on the surface is going to last long. And so you want something to threaten their Navy or anyone threatening you from a maritime perspective, and that's certainly true. But if it breaks out into a conflict, you had better be very mobile or have a very good integrated air and missile defense. And so all that needs to be considered. And when you do a modernization program, and those of you who've worked in that probably have a better feel for it than I did. I was always involved in one program and determining its niche in the overall picture. but your requirements are based on geography, your economy, and your territorial sovereignty and the need to protect it. And so for Philippine modernization, look for a maximum number of partners. The fact that you get with India is very good. India has some very good systems. Japan has entered into a security arrangement with you, and they have some very good technology. And of course, you have the Mutual Defense Treaty with us, and you've purchased equipment from South Korea. And so look at the mix and match that protects your maritime interests and protects the tools you use to protect your maritime interests, because they're integrated. You can't have one without the other. So anyway, that's the way I look at it. And I would do exactly as young Dr. Thayer said, is I would go back to the United States and say 5% is a good goal, but keep in mind, where do our requirements fit in with yours? Because we're going to prioritize our spending to fit our requirements. And we'll determine how much we spend on that once we calculate and determine how much of which we need to meet that requirement. So I realize that doesn't, we in the United States, we tend to think that everyone does their defense calculations the same way we do, but not everyone has the same interests we do and the same approach to tooling to meet those interests. And so just ask them to treat it more as a partnership rather than as a father talking to their children, if you will. A horrible way to put it, but I can tell you that my African and Asian students interpreted some of that in exactly that way. We're not your child anymore. We're a partner.
So did
Thank
the
you.
Secretary General Ruth Daddy, I think he called President Trump.
Yeah, indeed.
No. All right. Thank you so much. No, Japanese sister, of course, Dr. Taylor. Then we have another question from the president of St. Mary's School, Ma'am Marilu Costello of Cagayan de Oro City. Her question is, what will be the impact on the Philippines of China's invasion of Taiwan? Will it be drawn in this conflict or war?
Right. Well, there's 4 scenarios for Taiwan that I was told when I was in the Indo-Pacific, and China attacks Taiwan and America doesn't come to its aid, and 2 possible outcomes: Taiwan loses and Taiwan succeeds. And the second lot is America does come to Taiwan's aid and it loses or it succeeds. So I think it's is it China going to do it in a decapitating style? And every year, the annual report from the DoD on China used to tell the hundreds of missiles opposite the Fujian coast that were building up to reunify the country. You destroy it. I mean, quite frankly. And if, amphibious landing, John Mearsheimer, is creating difficulties. Well, one, you've got tens of thousands of Filipinos working there. You need to evacuate them. I mean, that's and protect their lives. 2, if you're going to come to Taiwan's aid, you're not going to do the expeditionary work. That's not your thing. But Batanes Island and others where you can occupy and threaten air and sea assets that try to get around to Taiwan's east coast. I mean, that's it. The Pentagon is talking about a hellscape in the Taiwan Straits, but it's, like in Australia, the debates here have always, by the time we mobilize and do it, will it all be over? I mean, it's the quickness of the speed with which countries can react, and only the United States has that capability, and it can work up. I mean, with Japan, I'm not saying exclude the others. Japan would be, and forces on Guam, etc. Bombers based in Australia, that the U.S. has, and our submarines, if we had the nuclear-powered ones, would in that time frame that we're looking at. So the impact, though, I mean, any conflict over Taiwan is going to hurt everybody's economy. It's going to just destroy the shipping through the South China Sea. It's going to make life miserable and difficult. Supply lanes are interrupted. But I say for the Philippines, it's your citizens that are there. You've got how to get them out, how to protect your northern approaches from attack, and to be able to repel and deter any Chinese air and naval pick up on Captain Schuster's kind of comments, it seems to me. And that's why the US through EDCA and the rotational presence is absolutely vital, because of the kind of hardware that the US can bring in and dispersal. The US is immediately as Taiwan happens, America's got to disperse its forces so China doesn't know where to hit, or can't strike in one place and do a hit like the Ukrainian drones did on the Russian Air Force. So and it's when I hear people in the Philippines your democracy, talk, oh my God, we're going to get called into a war. Hello, if we in Australia do nothing, we're going to suffer as well. And the final question to ask is it when it ends, is it in the Philippine interest to see China prevail or not? It's simple to me. It's that where you stand has to answer that question. Are you going to be better off if mainland China takes Taiwan by force and you're next or whatever? Or is it best that China is deterred and or defeated if it decides to do something reckless like that? So, and then where can you contribute? So like the Korean War, everybody from Latin America could contribute forces to Korea, but who's going to do the heavy fighting? The countries with the largest ground forces that are there. And but it doesn't mean you can't have niche, and that doesn't mean you can't base your own missiles, protect your coast. And that's part of that. And I love Captain Schuster's getting into how you do your force capability planning. And I think, linking air and naval. So, and hopefully you move up every year, you look at the kind of threat perceptions and the imminency and making judgments, and you're structuring your forces and buying ahead to meet those contingencies. So by staying out of a war on Taiwan, you don't improve your situation. Your economy is going to suffer. And at the end, that would ruin the American alliance, for example. Or if China did succeed, can there be a holding operation where the Philippines is then kept safe? So,
thank you, Dr. Thayer. Captain Schuster, for the.
Well, if Taiwan, building on Dr. Thayer's question, if China conquers Taiwan, whether they do it militarily or by political pressure, that gives them a doorway into the Western Pacific. And you've already seen a Chinese aircraft carrier group operate off your East Coast. And so the worst case for the Philippines, if Taiwan becomes part of China under the current form of government that Beijing has, then they already enjoy potential leverage over your maritime links through the South China Sea. They capture Taiwan and they'll have leverage over your maritime access off your East Coast through the Philippine Sea and South. And so taking Taiwan gives China significant leverage over the Philippines' access to air and maritime trade. And so most analysts would argue that if Taiwan comes under Beijing's thumb, then Philippines and Japan will lose significant independence and control over their air and sea lanes to the east. So it doesn't mean you automatically mass up your troops and launch into the fighting, but it gets back to Dr. Thayer's point. If you defend your sea lanes, the Bashi Channel and your northern front, so that no combatants come wandering through your integrated air and missile defense system, if you will, umbrella, then you're contributing in a way that fits your niche and national interests. And so that's my view.
Thank you so much, Captain Schuster and Dr. Thayer. Okay. Now there is a question from the Chief of International Defense and Security Engagement Branch of the Philippine Army, Sir Jerry Santig. The question is, what is the best diplomatic way to respond with the aggression of China in the disputed sea?
Well, if we make comparisons with Vietnam, you don't have a communist party that's in power. But every time the leaders meet and sign a joint communique, they stress the importance of continued high-level exchanges, leader to leader. And then it works down military to military contacts. So you have your ordinary diplomatic service, but you never break off the dialogue. You try to keep it as high as possible. And then you develop a strategy to use the multilateral institutions in which China is also a member. It's a comprehensive partner, a strategic partner with ASEAN. So there's annual meetings every year. There's the East Asia Summit, which Trump doesn't go to, Xi Jinping didn't go to, Putin didn't go to. That has to be revived, and so you work to try to, if you want to have ASEAN centrality, as it's so called, and the convening power, as it's called, you at least get the big people at the table, and then you can at retreats and other meetings try to influence their developments. So, in other words, but as the U.S. is finding, you don't want to have those mill-to-mill talks cut off. You want them to continue. You can develop, like through the Western Pacific Code, the Code of Conduct on Encounter at Sea. I mean, you can work bit by bit to try to build trust and confidence or reassurance. More transparency. White papers was the rule. China's never stopped spending. Every decade it keeps going and going, keeps challenging and asking them why these capabilities. Challenge their narrative. They keep saying, oh, the Typhoon missiles are driving them nuts. Well, the security dilemma is the other way around from where I'm sitting. China's military is growing, and that makes us way down under, very nervous about what's occurring. And to have a Chinese ship come all the way down, get under our southern underbelly, oh, that's all legal, and then go off and do live firing exercises. What message are they trying to take? And then we found out we had ships that weren't repaired and couldn't effectively monitor and even pick them up to begin with. It had to be a civilian pilot. That's a wake-up call. So when you're looking at what can be done is, what is the best way? I've talked about the diplomatic side, but it also means improving your military intelligence and the sensor systems. So you can both borrow the satellite information or use it from the U.S., et cetera, and all that, but have your own capabilities in particularly sensitive and niche areas. So you have a knowledge of what is particularly occurring. But I'll just end where I began. Always keep the leader-to-leader meetings going. Defense minister, your foreign ministers are going to meet anyway through other pre-established mechanisms. And never give that up, and don't go dumb and say nothing. Keep expressing yourselves in diplomatic language as you are doing. Make the protest, call them out, and at head-to-head level, have gumption. You get in there and defend your job. Coach is sending you out to Beijing. What are you going to do? Defend Philippine sovereignty and national interest. Tell them like it is. You're not threatening China.
You're giving them a free exchange of your ideas.
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Okay. Dr. Schuster, any reaction or insights?
Yeah, the other thing about meeting with him in talks is very often you'll get indicators of changes in the theme or new emphasis in the narrative they intend to push. And so those meetings not only give you an idea to communicate your perspective and let them know that you're aware of what they're doing and what your opinion is, your sovereignty, we don't tolerate that. But you're also keeping yourself and your government informed on this little nuance was introduced this time. And then that starts people thinking about what's next. And if you can anticipate what's next, you can counterpunch more quickly and more effectively. So that's one thing certainly to consider. The other one is on the military side, give them something else to think about. You don't need to fly a bomber over them. 20 or 30 drones flying about 400 feet overhead in your waters. Don't have to do anything, just fly overhead. And they know they're being watched and they got to wonder what you're going to do. Anything that introduces questions undermines their confidence, and it gives you more information to use against their narrative and support your own. So the idea here is keep them aware of your narrative and be ever ready to counter theirs and give them something else to think about. Doesn't mean you have to do anything aggressive. You certainly don't want to go, shall we say, nose to nose in a water cannon engagement. You're outnumbered and you're outgunned. But they're becoming increasingly embarrassed by the publicity about their actions. And they haven't fully decided how they're going to counter it. So anything that adds to your narrative at their expense is a good thing. Just something to think about.
Thank you so much, Captain Schuster. This is, my question is coming from me, of course. With your observations, I would like to, get your observation, ask your observation. Is this really happening now in the Philippines between and China? Having all these talks. I know there are many diplomatic protests, Captain Dr. Thayer.
So I'm not sure I understood the nuance of the Philippines is, there's no question of its present diplomacy. It's a question of maintaining those high level connections with China. I don't recall a strong presence at the Shangri-La dialogue. I think, and China didn't send its defense minister anyway, and that could be called out. But in other words, you keep at it, but it's not. You're not just doing it alone. You're going to meet with America. You're going to meet with Australia. You're going to meet with Japan. You're meeting with South Korea, and they can also add weight. Tell China to get with the act and get talking. Don't come to us, China, and tell us what to do with the Philippines. You and the Philippines get together, and we're going to support the Philippines. By the way, and so it's constantly reaffirming what your allies are up to, and Captain Schuster was that brilliant because I don't get high level, the nuance. I love that. In other words, you get Xi Jinping, unscripted, has got to respond one-on-one to somebody else. Now, he can blurb a somebody line or whatnot, but that's a way of gathering human intelligence, its capabilities and intentions, and its intentions that are the hard part. Leave it to American intelligence and the rest of the world to tell us what their capabilities are. You can pick up on your own and add to that, as we do. But in the intentions, that's the difficult bit. And the more, and in the diplomatic community, that's why ambassadors talk with one another constantly in the capitals where they're posted. But high-level dialogues, I think, are important because Xi Jinping goes to the Southeast Asia, it's Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia. He didn't go to the Philippines. You got to find out what he told all them, but try to get those countries to say, hey, you should, Xi Jinping, visit the Philippines when it's appropriate, encounter. And you're watching, Trump won't meet our Prime Minister Albanese, but he's going to be meeting Xi Jinping shortly. That will make him better guest in the White House to find out what's going on there. And I think to me, you can't be in the game without playing it. And the high level, I stress that. And you can say, oh, well, nothing ever comes out of it. But look, in preparing for tonight, what China pulled out of their files and say, here's what Duterte gave us in private. And do you know about that? So that's what you have to guard against. And that's why you can get the goods on China, because you can keep a record of that conversation. And if China then resiles from it, or, what in the Rose Garden when Xi Jinping told President Obama, I'm not going to do, and then he goes off and militarizes the features. I mean, that's where, if we had a starting gun that Carl Schuster could provide, we should have been out there immediately hitting China back, with that. Here's the Rose Gardens talk of Xi Jinping over and over again. He's not going to militarize, and then pictures of all these dredgers and stuff that was going on. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. There's another question from the executive producer and director of the IBC 13, that's a TV network in the Philippines. Miss Janina Gundaya. I'm not sure if she's here, but of course, I will just read her question. is there hope? I know you mentioned about the code of conduct earlier. Is there hope for creating a code of conduct in the South China Sea that will bind all nations concerned? What would it take to come up with such an agreement? I know we have been talking about this code of conduct for many years, Dr. Thayer. Thank you.
Well, drawing on my research, where Philippine officials and Malaysians were talking about it, everybody thinks it's going to be settled in 2026, but the Filipinos say it's moving very glacially and slowly. You see, binding all states, that's the first one, because the code of conduct with China is you can't have exercises with anybody outside the region. You can't have your resources exploited from anybody outside the region. I know I was leaked the original text of what China put in there. So, in other words, you can't bind all. So, what's needed, and I've got a list, is a protocol like the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, where other nations can sign on and pledge themselves to uphold the principles of whatever code of conduct is agreed to. Third parties, China doesn't want them in there. So, and to bind all countries, well, that it needs to be made a treaty, needs to be deposited with the UN. But in that code, you have details of, if there are incidents, it's wonderful. Oh, you can go back and look at radar coverage and radio transcripts and everything about an incident. But what about enforcement? And the only kind of enforcement in there is the individual ASEAN countries saying the ASEAN High Council of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. They should hear what's going on. So legally binding, you get the national legislatures to approve it and you deposit it with the UN. But what is the enforcement? That's the rub. And the area that it covers, and I joke and I say, let's just say it takes only the areas that China claims around the Spratlys. So as soon as you sail out of that area, you can be beaten up. China doesn't have to obey its code of conduct. You get too close to the paracels. So the area, the legality, the enforcement, third parties, I think all have to be in the brew. And then from the Philippines' point of view, don't sign. You can't have a code of conduct unless all 9 parties, Myanmar, Laos, never submitted, are in agreement. You know what your national sovereignty is. Don't sign a document that allows China to trample on it. A Vietnamese high-level diplomat, now retired, used the expression on the code of conduct, the journey is more important than the destination. Constantly keeping China in dialogue and dumping complaints every time you have these meetings on them. And then you end up getting the ASEAN saying some nations complain that this and this happened. But in other words, China's getting the earful. So in other words, draw out. China has been able to use the consensus principle to influence Cambodia or other countries to prevent progress. And I would say, for the Philippines, at one point years ago, the expression was the Philippines is an orphan. No one's supporting us. Is what I'm saying, and I tell this to the Vietnamese as well, do not sign the code of conduct if your national interest can't be protected. And so what do you do the first time a Chinese ship rams into you and says, we're enforcing our laws? And you find it's a blatant violation of that code of conduct. So the code of, okay, let's use Gat-Mashusa's word. The code of conduct needs to spell out consequences. What happens if you do that? And that's not in there yet. I mean, I've everything I've looked at, the tough part is coming at the very end. And at the moment, China keeps citing, oh, we love UNCLOS, we'll do this, we'll do that. And you go, yeah. But what do you do when your national law conflicts with what you agreed in the code? You're going to enforce it, or you're going to step back and accept the code of conduct?
Thank you, Dr. Thayer. Dr. Schuster, would you like to add something on that?
Yeah, the only thing I can add, and I'm kind of piggybacking on Dr. Thayer's comments, and that is dictating who you conduct military exercises with is an intrusion into your sovereignty. And the second thing is, what if China violates the code of conduct? You know, they signed UNCLOS and ratified it, but then after they started intruding into the West Philippine Sea and rejected the Court of Arbitration, the Foreign Ministry issued a statement that they never accepted UNCLOS authority over Chinese territorial waters, which are irrefutable and unquestioned. Okay, but they didn't say that in writing when they signed the treaty. And so once again, you've got a dichotomy that you can expose. And I would use that in any discussion of the code of conduct. Here's what you said about this treaty, and you violate it consistently, and you don't obey court rulings under that treaty. So what are the consequences for a Chinese captain who rams a Vietnamese or Philippine Coast Guard vessel or cargo ship or fishing boat? And whatever they tell you, get it in writing and make sure the world sees it. But I wouldn't sign it until you had both of those requirements met. I would not. It's easy for me to say. I'm not one of the countries, shall we say, dealing with it. But China wants to deal with you one-on-one. That's why they don't want third-party exercises or support. So they're telling each of you one-on-one, and trust us, we'll only beat you up when we're in the mood. And so I don't think it'll be signed in 2026 or 2030 until China relinquishes the third-party exercise routine and agrees to consequences for Chinese ships and vessels violating the code. I don't see China doing either of those.
Thank you, Captain Sister. I would like to add a question with regard to the Declaration of Conduct, Dr. Thayer. Of course, this was before the Code of Conduct. And I know that I think sometime in last week of May, right? China had this kind of propaganda that they have disarmed military vehicles in the Sandy Cay, and of course they raised the Chinese flag in Sandy Cay, which is about 2 nautical miles away from Pag-asa Island. So, of course, the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea actually wrote a letter to President Marcos. The recommendation is to inhabit, all the territories of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, especially down there in Calayan Island Group. So, but I read somehow coming from the Philippine government that because of this declaration of conduct, the Philippines cannot do that. And that will be a violation of the declaration of conduct. My question is, if China doesn't even obey the arbitral tribunal ruling, and what is China's reason for about this declaration of conduct, Dr. Thayer? Thank you.
Well, the background is that prior to the declaration of conduct, the parties, in 1985, ASEAN issued its second statement of concern because of mischief reef. And there were calls for code of conduct. And in March 2000, and I have copies, codes of conduct were exchanged, but they couldn't agree on a whole series of points, including uninhabited treatment of fishermen, etc. So a non-binding political declaration, the declaration of conduct of parties in the South China Sea in 2002 was agreed. It's not a treaty, and it's not legally binding. It says here are a number of areas and exercise self-restraint, do not refrain from occupying unoccupied features. And that may be where it's coming from. But next, the arbitral tribunal responded to the Philippines saying, what are we entitled to? Here are a bunch of features. Are they islands, rocks, low tide elevations? So the tribunal declared that Subi is a low tide elevation. So you can't use Subi to claim Sandy Cay. But you could try on the opposite. If you try to take Sandy Cay as a land feature and say that's an island or a rock and we can extend it. Except that my understanding, and I'm quoting a YouTube interview with Justice Carpio, half the year it's underwater during bad weather, and half the year it's up. And now there are 3 sandy cays, and some of it's been created by debris flowing from construction activities itself. So we don't know what the legal status is, but it would be a base point from Pagasa, which is an island, for the Philippines to determine its territorial sea in that particular area because it's above. But you see people on the sand there. They couldn't spend the night without helicopters giving them water or anything else. So, and 2013 is when China started building its artificial islands. What have you done that's equivalent to the 5-star hotels? I mean, on Subi, Fiery Cross, and Mischief Reef. I mean, and the airstrips. That I think one American commander said, it takes everything in the world except the space shuttle can land there. Electronic warfare, missiles, harbors that are dredged, warships dock and come there. There's nothing equivalent to that. As I said, militarization should be viewed as a spectrum. China's at the war end. It's forward operating bases for aggressive actions. And what are you talking about? Sandy Cay being a military base? I mean, my God, the Chinese critiques of Vietnam's construction use a 2013 article in the Manila Times, which I looked up, that said they're going to base Gepard frigates on some of these, not even a whole acre of territory. What kind of infrastructure? I need Captain Schuster to tell me. You can have a frigate visit, perhaps, but it can't be permanently based there. It's got to be protected. It's got to have bunkers. It's got to have fuel. It's got to have everything else. And what about the crew? And you got to feed them and house them. And there's not any of that. So I'm digressing. Now, this is China's narrative. And, the Vietnamese always had an expression, the thief crying thief, to divert attention. And, you're violating the Declaration of Hello, folks. This is now 2025. Mm-hmm. But what happened back in 2013? What happened in, over Mischief Reef, 1995? Yeah. So it's and all the declaration says here are things that we could do, scientific cooperation, and we should move towards a code of conduct. Mm-hmm. That's the game. The bindingness is you didn't exercise self-restraint, China, and we should point that out. And what have you done? You haven't permanently put anybody on Sandy Cay. Mm-hmm. You visited it, put a flag up, and then left. So did the Chinese. And then and what is the legal status? And that's what you had them determine. And they said nothing in the South China Sea is an island. Mm-hmm. The law from ancient times, the land dominates the sea for international jurisprudence. And so your rock is entitled to so much, and an island is, but there's no islands. And so that legalists, it's like how many angels dance in the pin of a head. Sandy Cay can be a baseline to incorporate Subi. Mm-hmm. To bring that in. No, it's the reverse. Pagasa is the controlling feature, and that could be used for its baselines. So, and you're not violating the Declaration of Conduct of Party. You are, like extending the runway on Pagasa. China was going, how does that threaten regional peace and security? Because I remember once a plane went off the runway with journalists there to cover what was going on, showing the runway needed repair. It's as simple as that. And you can't say repairing isn't creating self-restraint means you're going to have planes crash there if you don't repair.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Thayer. Captain Schuster, would you like to add on that one?
I can only add one sentence, and that is that Sandy Cay is less than 3 miles from Pagasa Island, and any geographic feature within your territorial waters is yours. And since Pagasa Island is recognized Philippine territory, right, and you use a 12 nautical mile territorial sea limit, then it's yours. It's a geographic feature that is Philippines under international law and UNCLOS. It's a geographic feature within your territorial waters from a legitimately recognized land feature, Gasa Island.
Yeah, and then I've got to ask the Filipinos president, when did people first from the Philippines settle on Pagasa? And I hear the 1970s, or, that's well before the Declaration on Conduct of Parties.
I know. Yeah, of course, Pag-asa was established under President Marcos Sr. in 1978.
Oh, thank
And
you.
then, of course, in 1978. So now, of course, there military men settled first in Pag-asa Island. And then until in 2000, there were civilian who resided there. And that's why, we are, I think last year, I even, the former mayor of the Pag-asa, the Kalayaan municipality, of course. Pag-asa is a barangay of the Kalayaan municipality. Of course, that's the seat of the Kalayaan municipality. But of course, it's in Pag-asa. I talked to him. I even asked him if there's a way that we can inhabit some of those, features there in the Kalayaan Island group. And I got a positive response from him. But of course, I don't have any kind of updates of what happened on that one. If there was really some civilians in other aside from Pag-asa. But of course, we have the military troops in other features of the Kalayaan Island group, like for example in Patag Island, that those other features. So anyway, that's another one. And actually, we're asking a response just to let you know if there our letter was referred to the National Security Council by President Marcos Jr. with the strategic recommendations about, of course, we mentioned about the Declaration of Conduct and those stuff. Like the question that I asked you, Dr. Thayer, All right, thank you so much for those responses. Anyway, there's a question. This is coming from Captain. He's a retired Captain Med Velasco from the Mico Air Rescue. He's the CEO of that, of course, from the Philippine Air Force, but he's retired. I know he has a very simple question, but I think that there's more in-depth responses to this one. If we have the arbitration ruling on our favor, and why are we not able to make use of the West Philippine Sea natural resources? So,
well, the simple thing is you are firmly entitled to doing that, and
yes.
It's China from the beginning attacked the arbitral tribunal and refused to accept it, and it's the party that's violating it. When the ruling came down, it told you what your features were. Now you know around this is low tide elevation. We can't do anything. Here's a rock. Yes, we can claim a territorial sea. Here are the baselines that go around that rock. Now, here's up from our land. This is our exclusive economic zone, and it extends here, here, and here. And you've made your baselines clear, and you've come up with laws about what your ships can do. The point is that if you try to exercise that and try to defend it, China does surges, and that's a never-ending struggle. And my favorite thing is develop kinetic weapons to take out the water cannons, and you've heard me endlessly on that. But that's why, and I second Captain Schuster, the narrative you continually pound away. This is the legal position. This is what we're entitled to. And you get the support. You're doing naval maneuvers and exercises. You're getting Japan, Australia, and other countries that has to continue. And I really think an American national security strategy report, which then usually leads to a maritime strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy. Come on, Trump administration, you haven't done your first year. It's supposed to be, I think, by the Goldwater-Nichols Act, 150 days, but with the budget's now been passed. Come on, Pete Hegseth, we need a national security strategy report to Congress, and then all across wherever America's operating, combatant commanders, its diplomats, can work with allies toward furthering that, and can adjust their spending, et cetera, as they see fit. So that's to me, it's from the Philippines' point of view, that would be a bonus, because it's going to talk about, Higgs said key allies, and I was doing a thing from Singapore. They wanted to know what ASEAN members should do, and I said, well, not all ASEAN members are key American allies. Philippines is, so we're talking to a special character, but you should develop it. And I've also, for the Malaysian Staff College, I called it a strategy of preemption. If you want to begin to explore for oil, you coordinated that with military exercises and other things, and the approaches that China is likely to take to interfere with it. And you had a USS America off, I think, it was visiting Malaysian exercises one year. You do that sort of thing, coordinate it, get your own forces out there, and let China be the first to throw the rock. And then they're in trouble, or dare throw the rock. So, in other words, you work with the oil companies, you provide the protection, you work with allies, and and I say you declare free fire zones, military exercises all around the place. You have everything present, and you're just telling China, you want to knock it off my shoulder? You pay the consequences.
Right.
But you're doing it in a passive way to put the onus on China.
And you're not doing it alone. So you won't be the only player they have to worry about if you're coordinating it with an exercise with a third party.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. So any additional comments on that one, Captain Sister?
No, I can't build on it.
All right. Thank you. I think Dr. Larapi has another question, actually, from Morocco. Is this Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea seeking to secure this region for patrolling, or mainly to clear this area for Western and U.S. Navy? I think I would like to ask Dr. Larafi, you're still here. I would like to clarify his question.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Larafi, I will promote you as a panelist, so please accept it. So we can clarify your question, because, yeah. Dr. Larafi is a university professor of the IB and TOEFL in Morocco. Yeah, and we're kind of like overtime. Dr. Larafi, please accept. I'm promoting you as a panelist, please. But anyway, most of the questions actually from our Zoom participants, I know we're kind of like, it's almost like 8:45, am I right? I know it's getting late. Yeah, do you have a question? Okay, there's a question, Professor Lamkin. Okay, Professor Lamkin, please. Would you like to?
Actually, not really questions. I just wanted to make a couple of observations. And anyway, the topic for tonight is, why is Vietnam and the Philippines being treated differently by China? And these are just a few quick observations. I don't know if you want to comment or not. Anyway, because probably each one would get into a whole big thing. Anyway, it's very simple. These are differences, okay? Vietnam is a communist country. Philippines is not. Philippines is a democracy. I don't know if that has anything to do with how they're treated or not. I would assume they do. Another thing, very obvious to me, because I've traveled to the Philippines a lot, the Chinese culture is ingrained in the Philippine culture and society. Many Filipinos have Chinese relatives, work for Chinese, etc., etc. I mean, they have totally infiltrated that country. Now, Vietnam, I don't know. Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, I don't know. I'm sure they all have Chinese, but the Philippines, I noticed that myself, very obvious. So I don't know if that affects how Filipinos feel about China and its aggression. And then I guess the last thing is just to me, it seems like China wants to take on one country at a time. I think Captain Schuster and Dr. Thayer, they probably both talked about this before, but that seems to me like they don't want to take on two or three countries at the same time. They'd rather get in there, subdue one of those countries to the best of their ability, and then move on to another one. So I think with if they feel that they could subdue the Philippines, that's like a big playing card in that South China Sea. Vietnam, yeah, it's got resources and stuff like that, but I think the Philippines is a lot bigger prize. So if they could somehow pressure the Philippines to be subdued, I think some of those other countries would kind of fall into place, so to speak. I could be totally wrong. Anyway, these are just a couple observations I wanted to say concerning the differences between those two countries.
Thank you very much, Professor Lamkin. Any reaction to that, Dr. Thayer?
Yeah, well, one, when I said that Vietnam's a communist country, what I meant was that one of the constraints on China, because there are few other communist countries, is to maintain I use the word conduit, because that's a way of influencing the government. And they run theoretical seminars. The political officers from Vietnam study in China. China can offer scholarships so that China doesn't. The constraint is they fought in 1970. What we didn't mention is Vietnam defeated China in the 79 border war, and they don't want to repeat that. But in other words, and does democracy make a difference? Yes, it does. I was saying because Duterte sang to Beijing's ears. That's why it's being treated different, because Marcos is doing something differently, and China doesn't like it. Okay, now the second, Chinese culture. Vietnam is occupied by China for 1,000 years. I borrowed, there was a history of Australia called The Tyranny of Distance. Australia, white settled, should be in the Atlantic, not where it was. And I used the tyranny of geography for Vietnam's relations with China. 1 million Vietnamese are one middle-sized Chinese province. And one of my students who wrote his PhD on this says, Carl, you're too harsh. We borrowed so much from them politically. Confucian, Marxism, so we have to bear that in mind. And also, long ago, Secretary General at the 40th anniversary of Doi Moi, I quoted him and I was told I shouldn't have. If China succeeds, we succeed. If China fails, we fail as a socialist one-party state. So, I'm saying Vietnam doesn't do the twists and turns that upset China the way a democratic but the Chinese culture, as a result of the 79 border war, the Hua, the ethnic Chinese people, became the meat in the sandwich. Many fled across the border to northern Vietnam, out of northern Vietnam, and China sent 3 boats to pick up the ostracized and persecuted Hua people from Saigon's sister city. Chalon was big market. That was Chinese. Yes, you do have a Chinese component in Vietnam, but it's not the same. But you have that cultural borrowing that Vietnamese feel, but they're different. After 1,000 years, I said we've got enough we want to do. And do you want? And Ron's observation wants to take one country at a time. That was my first line about intimidation. It's complicated because of the U.S. alliance, but if you can break the Philippines without having to go that far, because Sarah Duterte gets elected or something, and she changes the whole ball game as her father did. Then that suits China, and it suits China for the think tanks that exist, and I hear them speak. Oh, we're going to be pulled into a war over Taiwan. Oh, we're going to this or that. We should. It doesn't mean you make China an enemy. And I reply, all of us in Australia, we're an ally of the U.S., no question. But we also trade with China, and we have to have our own way of working around and getting that. And you're right. I think former Kevin Rudd, our former foreign minister, who's a fluent China specialist, if you want to deal with China, go as a gang. Don't go alone. And therefore, Ron, I'll turn it around. China doesn't want a gang to form because it's too difficult. I think we're on the same wavelength, but it's good that I said these are my thoughts, the scratches on my mind as to why, and you could single it out. But in other words, I'm really trying to make how can China insist on its laws and not punish Vietnam the same way it's doing to the Philippines every day? Why is it being that inconsistent? And Vietnam is constructing more than the Philippines ever did. And Chinese spokesmen are all militarizing these features unbelievably. In ways I don't think Vietnam. If they're going to put modern aircraft on a runway out in Canada Bark Reef, you don't put a plane out there for that long. And they can land and take off. They can visit, but it's So what I'm getting at is I try to take the pieces where that Vietnam complains about fishing and it doesn't get smashed, but Philippines and China criticizes them both. But when push comes to shove, it's fewer features and it's not massive construction on the Philippines' part. And yet you're having these confrontations that are aggressive. But why not with Vietnam? Yeah. It's the same law for China's point. They're in.
Yeah. Part of it might be that Vietnam no longer challenges them in the area around Hainan Island and the Paracels. They do joint patrols, and the Vietnamese typically back down or cooperate with their Chinese counterparts. The other thing I think that China looks at, there's leverage they have over Vietnam that they don't have over the Philippines. For example, China's control over the Lakang River, which becomes the Mekong River. Its flow into Vietnam is only 40% of what it was 30 years ago, and that's affected Vietnam's aquaculture. The other thing, too, is China has now a dominant influential position in Laos. They're still competing, and Laos is a traditional ally of North Vietnam when it was Annam and when it became unified. And Cambodia is essentially a pro-Chinese neutral, although they don't want to be involved in a Sino conflict with anyone. But China has significant influence over Vietnam's Western neighbors. They don't want to fight that mountain border again. Getting back to Dr. Thayer's point, they suffered heavy losses in 1979 without ever fighting frontline Vietnamese troops. The troops that slaughtered the Chinese troops, the Vietnamese troops that slaughtered were all reservists.
Yep.
They were people's militia. Now, they were all mostly combat veterans of the war with America. Yep. But if you're in China, by the way, established special forces and a Marine Corps after that war. It's one of the lessons they learned because Vietnamese sappers did such a good job in the Chinese rear. So all that adds together. And because Vietnam is a communist country, I think, beating up on a communist brother affects their credibility in relations with other communist countries. But also, there is a consistency in most communist governments that makes actions predictable. And Vietnam, because of their situation, does a very good balancing act. They're they're discussing multiplying their sources for arms and things in their trade agreements and so forth. Philippines is headed there, but I think for many years you had to fight two insurgencies within your country, and that limited the resources you had to deal with external problems. And as late as 2015, China was ramming and sinking Vietnamese fishing boats and leaving the crews to drown.
Mm-hmm.
And that ended sometime between 2016 and 2017. So there's a myriad of factors, and I think a lot of it has to do with Vietnam coming with the joint Coast Guard patrols and accommodation of China's perspective in the Paracel Waters area. They backed down on the oil exploration, which was even in their territorial waters in some segments. And Vietnam is looking at China's encroaching leverage along their western border, which has traditionally not been a threat axis for Vietnam. And so China may feel that they've got Vietnam almost where they want them.
Mm.
And pressing that case means adding another country, as we've been saying some time. They prefer to go one country at a time. Vietnam's now the quiet front, and the Vietnamese and the Philippines is the forward front or the main front. And Malaysia and Indonesia don't want to get involved. They're perfectly happy to let the Philippines take the heat. And I think if China gets their way with the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea, then Malaysia will be next. But that's an opinion. We'll see.
If I could, all quiet on the Eastern Front is one of my favorite expressions about Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much, so player and Captain Sister. Of course, before we will make some announcement for the future events and our closing remarks and some few words from you. I would like to acknowledge the following, of course, those who support our webinar. Of course, the Philippine Army, the Philippine Strategic Forum, the Philippine Air Force, the National Defense College of the Philippines, the Department of National Defense, the Philippine Navy, the Philippine Coast Guard, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Office of the President, Presidential Office on Maritime Concerns, the Philippine Army Indo-Pacific NCO, the Sophia University, of course, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the National Security Council, the Filipino Friends of Labor, Clergy of Good Governance, Fulbright University in Vietnam, Women's Alliance for Security Peace, the St. Mary's School, the National Taiwan University and Fire University, the Cellar French Wine Selection, the Resin Lord's Vineyard Catholic Community, the IBC 13, the CSU Carry, the Miko Air Rescue, the WEC International, Senecal Sisters, the Daughters of Charity, of course, Ambassador Eileen Mendoza, the Philippine Ambassador to Israel. Thank you so much. And the Nanhua University, we have Professor Pu Sinyong Soon from Taipei, the European External Action Service, the University of Santo Tomas, the University of the Philippines. We have the Martinez Tria Law Office, and we have Attorney Ted Pasqua right here. Of course, you know, your question has been answered by Dr. Taylor about the is it a matter of intimidation? And we have the Department of Interior and Local Government in Manila Field Office. I mentioned already the Philippine Coast Guard, the Embassy of Vietnam, Captain Rigoberto Buonata of the Philippine Navy. We have the branch chief of the CMO training and doctrine and a developmental branch of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, Miss Kimberly Balita. And of course, we have the Imagineer Center for Integrated Studies, the Concerned Persons on Philippine Security, and we have the Avial Cruise Consultancy, the MMC, that's the Sean Lorenzo, MCM, Ariel Valones, the Clerk of Court, of course, of the Supreme Court of the Philippines, the Public Attorney's Office, the Maritime Training Center, and we have the military officer from the Philippine Army, Sir Warlito Limit, and Mr. Alim Tahi at KME. And of course, we have some participants. If I missed your names and organizations, my apology. And I would like to make some few announcement. Our next webinar will be on Thursday. That will be July 10, 2025, same time, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And our guest speaker is retired Honorable Justice Antonio T. Carpio. And the topic is time to resolve the maritime and territorial dispute in the West Philippine Sea through arbitration. Of course, on July 12th, that will be the 9th anniversary of the victory of the Philippines at the Arbitral Tribunal, The Hague, Netherlands. We're going to have our 16th virtual international conference on West Philippine Sea, China Sea. And of course, that will be the theme is 9 years after Arbitral Tribunal, the challenges and in the peace, security, and stability in the West Philippine Sea and the world. And of course, we have invited different international speakers. Of course, that would include Dr. Thayer, Captain Schuster, and speakers from Taiwan, from Tokyo, and of course from the Philippines and USA and some other countries. And I'll be sending you the Zoom invitation link again for that. And of course, on July 19, we're going to have another webinar that would be Saturday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. by Dr. Benjamin Landin. He's a security expert, also from France, uh, Paris, France. So I'll be sending all these Zoom invitation links again for this webinars. That's about like 4 days from now. So hopefully you can share, and please, if you can support again our future events. And we really appreciate and thank you so much for all your continuous support. Now, before we end, I would like to call Dr. Thayer for some few words before we end this.
Well, I
this
want to keep
webinar.
them very brief because I say I was just scratching my mind. I was looking for feedback from the audience. I apologize. I just looked at the questions, and there are people that have thought I could reply, but I was
Oh,
too
there
busy.
is a question.
Yeah,
I'm
there's.
sorry. Let me read. I think there's another question. I did not see
I
that
didn't want to
Q&A
hold you.
before. Oh, yeah. So I think this is coming from Mr. Robert Chuidian. Uh, have you read that comment already, Dr. Thayer?
I've
Dr.
read it.
Thayer, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
I've read it. It boils down to whatever my proposals were. How keen is the U.S. as an ally along this course of action? And the answer, I can't be definitive, but when you had Pete Hegseth constantly use strategic deterrence against China,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of these things that can be negotiated. Now, we know that the previous administration offered to accompany your patrols and you declined, but this was different. I was saying that you organize a maritime exercise around the areas where the oil exploration is going to take place. I mean, you look in advance, what are the lines that China is likely to use if there were nobody there? And you announce it ahead of time. Three of us are getting together and we're going to run these naval exercises with live firing. Please, everybody clear out. And then inside that cordon, you end up having your oil company with whoever it hires begin the exploration on that you maintain a naval presence, Coast Guard presence as well, around that oil rig. And you try to work out ahead of time with your partners what your responses would be if China began to come in and try to interrupt those proceedings itself. So, one, I'm thinking the U.S. administration has put the money where the mouth is. What is strategic deterrence? And what do you do if the resources of the Philippines are not able to do that? the Philippines argument, we need it for energy security. Energy security means economic growth. Economic growth means we could spend more on the military. We could buy American equipment, South Korean equipment. We could be much more effective as an ally in that particular way. And you're not asking for the U.S. to confront the Chinese. You're getting, as I call it, preemptive. You're there before. You don't tell on such and such a day we're going to start an oil production. No, you announce these exercises, you have the ships patrolling, you get them out there, and then you pull the rabbit out of the hat. Oh, by the way, the National Oil Company has begun working in Recto to develop oil. It's doing a survey. As I make China throw the first punch or refrain. It has to understand in its mind what are the consequences, to use that word from Carl Schuster, if they do take a particular action. I call it preemptive. If you did nothing, they would just flood the area with ships and come in. If they don't know the time, don't know the month, don't know what the Philippines are up to, it complicates it.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Freya. Captain Schuster? Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a perfect answer. I can't add to it, I assure you.
Yeah, all right.
None.
Okay. So, in a way, of course, some few words before we're gonna end this webinar. That's a very excellent presentation, Dr. Thayer, and of course, Captain Schuster with all your additional insight, reactions, and to all our participants and those who ask questions and and even though you did not ask questions, but you know your presence is very very important in this webinar. And because there are some, you know, who opted not to be mentioned actually. That's why I asked whether would you like your name or organization to be mentioned. So we respect that, you know, and I'm the only one getting the registration. Just to let you know, I'm the only one receiving your registration form because, you know, there's some, of course, some personal information in that one. So trust me, it's just through I'm the only one. So don't hesitate to register and attend our webinar. So again, Professor Lumpkin, any words? No more? Okay. Again, on behalf of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, I would like to extend our sincerest appreciation to Dr. Carl Thayer from Canberra, Australia, who has been with us for the past, I would say, I think this is the 6th year we've been doing that, Dr. Thayer, right? But of course, we had some joint, I would say, conference way back in 2015. Dr. Thayer and I were in the Philippines. That's the time with the Vietnamese group. So, anyway, again, thank you so much, Dr. Thayer. Let's give him a round of applause again. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes. We are so honored and humbled. And of course, my co-host, that's why we call this the new West Philippine Sea Catch, because we add a co-host, Captain Carlo Schuster. Thank you very much, Captain Schuster. Thank you very much. And thank you. And of course, to Professor Lampin, who's always with us from the time, the inception of this National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, always in his support and in assistance. Thank you very much, Professor Ron Lampin. He is also, of course,
the Hawaiian.
Yes. Yes. Ever since a lifetime member of the movement. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm so proud to say Dr. Thayer and Captain Schuster are also members and advisors and consultants of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea. All right, maraming salamat. Thank you very much. And we'll see you again next week on Thursday with Justice Antonio T. Carpio. That's July 10th. All right, then we are now saying bye for now. This is Dr. Celia Lankin.
Bye.
Broadcasting live from Guam. And of course, Captain Carl Schuster, broadcasting live from Honolulu, Hawaii. And Dr. Thayer. from Canberra, Australia. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.
Y'all take care.
Cheers.